Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone here today. I know we have many people participating virtually as well. Thank you for attending. My name is Randy Nussbaum. My law firm, Sachs Tierney, and I, we've been proud supporters of the Genocide Awareness Week for many, many years. Last week, I was fortunate enough to actually speak with this afternoon's next speaker, Professor Grabowski. And it was supposed to be a very quick phone call, but we ended up speaking a lot longer than anticipated because of his willingness to talk to me about his background, and also because candidly, I had an insatiable curiosity about what he's going to talk about today. Now, Professor Grabowski will tell you about what he's done that's made him hated by many individuals in Poland, and the fact that he's been subjected to both litigation and vicious attacks. Actually, what was really incredible, he got sued because in one of his pieces, he talked about a Polish citizen who had cooperated with the Nazis, and a relative of that person sued him for telling that story. And what's even more amazing and sad, he lost initially at the trial level, and he was ordered by the Polish court to publicly apologize about telling that story. Fortunately, the Court of Appeals, I think in August of 2021, reversed that decision, but that gives you a good idea of what he's facing. As you're going to learn, he has devoted himself to ensuring that the true history of what really occurred in Poland will not be forgotten. Sadly, as I've mentioned before, the current administration in Poland, which is right-wing, has thrown every obstacle in his way to prevent him from going forward. But our guest has demonstrated courage and perseverance to stand up for what he believes is right, and he's been undaunted to ensuring that the truth will be told. Please join me in welcoming our next guest, Professor Grabowski. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. Which, by the way, can you hear me? You do. Okay. So thank you very much for this lovely introduction, and in part I will try to address the issues which have been mentioned. In part I will try to share with you some general comments about Holocaust and Holocaust in Poland, possibly in order to stimulate debate, to perhaps reflect upon issues which sometimes we tend not to reflect too much. I don't want to focus too much on my own campaigns, battles, and fortunes and misfortunes. If you have questions, I can of course try to answer them in the question period after our meeting. So let me start saying that I am very honored to be, however virtually, with you. I nearly missed our meeting because they canceled my plane. I just landed in Ottawa a few hours later than I thought I would. In any case, I'm happy to be with you. I will talk to you about, I can call it this talk, certain thoughts from notebook of a Holocaust historian with several decades, let's say, of research behind his belt. Now, as most of you probably would agree, Holocaust can be called, with certain justification, the most heavily researched event in history, or let's say one of the most heavily researched events in history. I don't want to make any competitions here. Nevertheless, the number of books, articles, theatrical pieces, you name it, comic books, as you know, is astounding. And we tend to forget that actually the study of the Holocaust is fairly, research into the history of the Holocaust is fairly a recent pursuit. Well, if someone told you in 1980s, which is not that long ago, that Holocaust would be at the center of huge international debates, congresses, and so on, people would shake their heads in disbelief. It really is a recent phenomenon. Just enough is to say that for the first 20 years after the event, after the Holocaust, there were practically no historians interested before Raoul Hilberg in serious study of the Holocaust. In any case, when I came to the research of the history of the Holocaust, I thought there was little actually to be learned more in terms of what has happened. Interpretations, yes, different little additions to our body of knowledge, but I was very curious, but I would not really believe that there was a swath of land to be discovered, entire maps to be drawn. No, that was not my idea. And actually, when I looked even more recently, if you look at what graduate students in various countries are doing in my area, they are sort of fleeing the purely historical research in order to focus on something we historians called meta-history of the Holocaust, so memorial studies, commemoration, and so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing is, I would like to share with you these few thoughts before I move into the essence, the core of my talk. The surprising phenomenon in the study of the Holocaust is that the history of the Holocaust, not history, but Holocaust as such, has become probably the only event in human history which has universal meaning, impact, universal importance. Now, you might disagree with my statement or agree, but I would be quite actually willing to defend it, that Holocaust has become a household name, so to say, regardless of whether you ask someone in New Zealand, China, or Denmark, or Canada. Not that people know much, but they can situate the event on moral, let's say, map of human history, and they know something, which is much more than you might find asking about any other event. Now, I do not have time, of course, to even try to discuss why Holocaust has become this kind of a universal phenomenon. Nevertheless, I would like to note this importance. The second thing is that one of these amazing things about the history of the Holocaust nowadays is when you look at the historical event, you can see that the more distant, chronologically speaking, we are from the Holocaust, the more it acquires importance and the higher temperature of heated debates can be seen. Now, this is very, very unusual. Normally, you would expect something quite different. The closer we are to the event, the more, let's say, questions it raises, the more passion it raises. Here, the more distant we grow, you can see the international debates with states committing their, let's say, diplomatic resources and forces, and scholars mounting the barricades. This is very unusual. Once again, food for thought. I don't have the time to go any further in analysis of this phenomenon. And the third issue which I wanted to mention is that history of the Holocaust has become a sort of a pawn in the hands of different states which use history of the Holocaust in a way instrumentally. And not only, of course, states, but also historiographical streams. Look, for instance, at the development of Holocaust historiography in Germany, how German historians and Holocaust scholars, what do they do? For the most part, the German society, and of course, German historians being part of that society, follow here or respond to a need, wanted to learn what was it that made German people complicit deeply complicit in the genocide. And they wanted to learn what was it and what, of course, can be done in order to prevent this thing from happening in the future. That's why the Germans, of course, with exceptions, but if you look at the mainstream German scholarship of this genocide and of the Holocaust, focused on something called Tätergeschichte, which is in German means the history of perpetrators. And this was, of course, interesting, useful, but of course, it was not the Holocaust itself, which was here at the core of the interest. It was, of course, the German society, which wanted to learn through this horror something more about itself. When you look at Israel and at the host of Jewish American historians, their focus was strongly on the victims, not surprisingly, wanting to learn what has happened to us, why it happened to us, who was to blame. Is it only the Germans? Was it our leadership, our own people perhaps? What did we do? Did we do anything wrong? So this is the other stream. Now, this is once again not the study per se of the Holocaust, but our desperate need to learn something more about our own society, about ourselves. And then we look at everybody else. Once we go beyond the victims and beyond the perpetrators, we are looking at this nebulous mass of hundreds of millions of people who were close, very close, somewhat distant, or very distant from the event. Nevertheless, they somehow reacted. They did not react. Sometimes the lack of reaction, of course, is to an ongoing genocide is also a very strong reaction. So unsurprisingly, of course, in countries such as the United States or Canada, questions were raised since 1970s and 80s, why we did so little, or could we have done something more? We were witnesses. What does it, in what light does it place us? And then you look at people who are closer by. For instance, you can see here the French historiography. In the beginning, Holocaust did not even appear on the horizon. The French society was portrayed through the lens of resistance, of a very patriotic resistance against the Nazis. Now, in other countries, such as, for instance, the Netherlands, people were asking questions also, what did we do? How our mothers, fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers behaved at these very complicated times and at this very, very complex point in time. And especially in the Netherlands, people started to ask themselves questions because how come that in the midst of the most tolerant European society, and the Dutch society has been for a long time prided itself on its tolerance tradition, undeniable tradition of tolerance, how come that in the Netherlands, in the lower countries, 75% of all Dutch Jews have been murdered, have been delivered and sent to their deaths in extermination sites in Poland? What happened? So these questions about bystanders not being bystanders started really to preoccupy people. And now moving to my area, which is Poland, which is my historical lab, a place I have been born and raised in, where I spent my first decades of my life, including my university education. Well, in Poland, like in other countries of Eastern Europe, there was very little willingness for any kind of open debate. The debate has been forced onto people, onto society in a way very late. very late in the day, and without much success, I would say. In Eastern Europe generally, in the place where the Holocaust physically occurred. Local nations, you can look here at Slovaks, at Ukrainians, at Poles, at Baltic states, mostly Lithuanians, but also looking to the southeast, Hungarians, Romanians, nations that were trampled later on by the communism. There was little sympathy for the Jewish victims, but I will get to it later on. Now, in the case of Poland, Holocaust is seen in, let's say, mainstream historical narrative as something completely external to Polish history. Normally, the official account will be that it was external, it was, between Germans and the Jews. Poles had not only nothing to do, but they could not do anything. And in some cases, you will also perhaps learn more if I have the time about it in a few moments. And in some cases, it was sort of a historical theater, which gave Poles a chance to help their Jewish co-citizens in the time of need, which is, of course, a sad joke and bitter historical fallacy. But what we tend to forget is that if you look at pre-war Polish borders, that's where close to 5 out of 6 million Jews, victims of the Holocaust, have been put to death. And this, of course, as they say, noblesse oblige, this kind of horror requires certain memorial work, which unfortunately in Poland has not been done. Not that nothing has been done, but not as much as should have been done. Just before I go any further, I will tell you that if you would like to guess, perhaps, how many museums of Holocaust have been erected, constructed in Poland, the answer is none. There is not even one museum of Holocaust in a country that lost 3 million of its citizens due to the policies of the Holocaust. This is telling. There is not even one funded chair at one Polish university devoted to the history of the Holocaust. So we do have a problem. I'm not even going any further, but the Holocaust looms large because there are pressures coming from outside. Western Europe recognized that Holocaust is not only German crime, that it is a European crime, that we Europeans have been somehow complicit to a degree, to a perhaps lesser or greater degree, but this is a burden we have to carry together. Unfortunately, this kind of admission is absolutely unpalatable in many countries of Eastern Europe. And of course, I, as an expert in Polish Jewish history, I'm focusing on that one especially. Well, so once I moved into the history as a professional historian, into the history of the Holocaust in Poland, I was amazed actually how many areas have not been addressed, have not been adequately addressed, and how much documentation there is still available that has barely been touched. Literally millions of pages of post-war trials, we call them August trials, which came to light just about 20 years ago. It's nothing in terms of historical research, which have been, let's say, combed here and there, but this trove of information, local archival collections, which have not been really perused and never tapped by historians. Many questions, basically most of them questions dealing with what happened between bystanders and the Jews, but not only, many other questions too. So first of all, what do we know about the event, Holocaust in Poland? First of all, we are looking at certain numbers. Some of you know that pre-war population of Polish Jews was probably close to 3.5 million, although we will never know exactly because Polish last census was very imprecise. It happened in 1931, so just certain, let's say, estimates can lead us to believe that close to 3.5 million Jews lived in Poland. Now, this was a fragile community. So to understand the impending disaster, you have to look at the people who were entering this historical catastrophe. The nation of Polish Jews with its own language, customs, traditions. Basically, 20% of all Jews in the world were Polish Jews. So this community was fragile because, as you know, late 1930s, mid through late 1930s were a bad period of time, period of massive growth of nationalisms, whether you looked internationally or nationally. In Poland, it translated into state nearly approved economic boycott, a huge attack on Jewish professionals. I would like here to read to you a few lines of a poem that some of you might perhaps know, but if not, then please. The poem is in Yiddish, name was Es brennt. Translation, our town is burning. So the poem goes, our town is burning, tongues of flames have almost consumed the whole town, and the raging winds howl. The moment is at hand when, God forbid, our town, along with all of us, will be turned to ashes by the flames, and only bare black walls will remain as after a battle. Our town is burning, and only you can save it. Extinguish the fire with your very blood if you must. Don't just stand there, brothers, with folded arms. Now, the thing is that this poem has not been written due to the policies of Nazi Germany or the Holocaust. It is a poem by Mordechai Gebirtik, who was a Krakow poet, and he wrote this poem in 1936. And he was not even referring to some horrifying vision of the ashes burning cities and burning people. He was referring to pogroms, which occurred in Poland in 1936, more specifically, so-called Przytyk pogrom. So you see the, let's say, doom on the horizon. But on the other hand, Polish Jews were also thriving culturally. It was still the Jewish capital of Jewish thought, of theater, publications, newspapers, journalists, vibrant. So, as they said, worst of times and best of times. So what happens is, what I would like to understand in these few minutes, this 40 minutes that I have with you, is an attempt to understand how come that this 3.5 million strong community in 1939, the heart of Jewish nation, so to say, 10 years later, or even 7 years later, stopped being, let's say, a marked phenomenon in any kind, shape, or form. What happened here? So now, as you know, of course, with the German invasion of Poland in 1939, the Jews were very quickly relegated, expelled beyond the margins of the mainstream society. On the one hand, you have the pre-existing anti-Semitism, which facilitated the German policies, no doubt about it. The thing is that the Nazis, the Germans, when they arrived with certain mind frame. And at the core of their mind frame was that Jews were simply agents of evil, that creating world without Jews had a redemptive, let's say, call to itself. And each and every means they might want to use, or they could use, were actually put in place. Now, as soon as Germans arrived, they started to exploit the pre-existing anti-Semitism, and their main goal was to dehumanize the Jews. Now, the thing is that when you look at the history of the genocides, and I'm certain that among you there are many scholars and people interested in various genocides, you will see that this is a pattern which is a recurrent pattern. This is the dehumanizing your opponent until the elimination, it's not killing anymore, of your opponent becomes a sort of a natural gesture. This person is no longer considered a human being. So this dehumanization of Polish Jews occurred at an alarmingly swift rate. It took between weeks and months, at the best a year and something, to transform this huge, let's say, minority, thriving minority, into people, faceless crowd. And so what happened here was legal restrictions, of course, which proved that the Jews were not entitled to work as non-Jews or together with non-Jews. They couldn't be, there were restrictions placed on their mobility. There were curfews. There was branding, very important branding. So every and each Polish Jew above the age of 10 had to wear a armband with the blue Star of David on a white armband. Now, humiliating work, slave work for all male Jews, and then ghettos. So not only this legal exclusion, but also physical exclusion. Now, most of you have heard of large ghettos such as Łódź or Warsaw or Kraków, walled in. What we tend to forget here, and once again, this is a topic that really begs for further study, is that a majority of Polish Jews lived in small shtetls. There were no walls. Sometimes there were flimsy fences, sometimes even no fences at all. Nevertheless, people knew where the ghetto started and where it ended. And there were restrictions which were quite real imposed on the Jews, and people knew what could be done, and German regulations were enforced. Now, Jewish reactions to this horrifying set of let's say attacks on their society was based on previous experience. We as individuals and we as societies, we draw upon our historical experience. It can be a recent one, can be a long-lasting one, or an old one. The same was with the Jews. The assumption was that if you prove yourself somehow useful, you can earn your life. You can save your life. That was at least logical assumption. We're not in the time of racial war, which was, of course, the Holocaust. Here, the goal was annihilation of a people, not because of what they did, but of who they were. And so how to navigate the catastrophe, Jewish masses, Jewish leadership did not know. Now, the ghettos, as you know, became a place of mass starvation. In Warsaw alone, before even the policies of genocide have been implemented, 90,000 people in Warsaw alone starved to death or fell to diseases. Even before the policies of modern mass murder have been put in place. And then comes the period of time which will be discussed today. You will hear much more from eminent specialist, Father Dubois, about Holocaust by bullets. So 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union, attack on the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany, and the Holocaust by bullets in other words, the mass shootings. Actually, this period of time, which started in June, July 1941 and lasted for a year or so, can be called not only Holocaust by bullets, but also Holocaust by pitchforks, by axes, by knives and other farm tools. This is something that Omer Bartov calls communal genocide. This is not only Germans going on rampage, not only the Einsatzgruppen. This is when the Germans trigger something called, they call Selbstreinigung. Selbstreinigung means in German self-cleansing. They will stimulate the local populations, and local populations will answer the call to various degrees. They will go from Lithuania in the north, the massacre of Kovno, through the Jedwabne and Radziłów in Poland, all the way down to Lviv and to Odessa, you name it. You can see this explosion of hate against a fragile, progressively dehumanized minority. And then come the Aktionen. And then come the Aktionen, which actually are one more understudied part of this horrifying history. This is something actually I devote a lot of my time to. Aktionen are the liquidations of the ghettos. In the spring, summer, fall of 1942, the Germans undertake or open up the policy of so-called final solution of the Jewish question. In other words, the Holocaust begins the massive industrial modern age mass murder of a nation. Now, the thing is that you have heard about people brought to extermination, to the death camps, such as Treblinka, Bełżec, Sobibór, Majdanek, Auschwitz. But if they tell you that Jews were delivered or brought to, it does not even start to scratch the surface of what has been going on in Poland at that time. So if you have hundreds of ghettos, that's what you have. And each of them is being liquidated by an atmosphere of absolutely horrifying terror. In some areas, up to 50% of the ghetto population is being murdered in situ, in their shtetl, in their ghetto, in the atmosphere of this horrifying terror instituted by the Germans and their enablers in the public sphere. Now, when I was looking at these days of horror, sometimes it was hours of horror, sometimes days, some weeks of horror, depending on the size of the Jewish community, you could see that the less forces Germans were able to muster, the more they relied on local helpers who have really been left largely alone by historians. They should not. They deserve our very close scrutiny, because what happens to trained murderers, we more or less know. But how people who, this is something that I study, who are neighbors, who are schoolmates, what does it take to transform these people over a few weeks, sometimes days, into a murderous crowd that is willing to kill people well known to each other? This is this communal genocide about which I am talking. So now looking at the big scenario, in March 1940, the speed with which the nation of Polish Jews has been practically annihilated is practically without parallel in history. So if you look at this period of time, in March 1942, when the so-called Aktion Reinhard begins, 90% of Polish Jews were still alive. 1 year later, 90% of them have already been murdered. You can imagine this absolutely horrifying speed with which this genocide has been committed. So now Poland has become the center of final solution for a variety of reasons, for most of all because so many Jews were living in Poland. And then what happened, starting in 1942 and 1943, when the ghettos have been liquidated, many Jews fled into the open, desperate attempt to save their lives, to save the lives of their families. They fled the liquidated ghettos by tens and hundreds of thousands, and they tried to look for salvation, for help among the mainstream Gentile society, with very, very poor, generally, results. So this is also a part of things that I do in my work as a historian, to try to see what was the encounter of these Jewish refugees who had a working chance to survive once they entered in contact with their, let's say, Gentile neighbors. This story is a very sad story, a story which today the authorities in Poland try to prevent historians from telling as well. So in the end, I don't have much time and I want to have a few minutes for your questions. At the end of the day, if you look at the numbers, it is actually staggering. If you admit, and I hope that we can agree, that about 3 million Polish Jews at some point came under the German yoke, around 3 million. Various points in time. Some of them found themselves under the German occupation already in September 39, some others in July or June or August 1941, if they were east of the Soviet occupation zone. So out of these 3 million Polish Jews who had the misfortune of finding themselves under Nazi rule, 30,000 lived to see liberation, which means 1%. In other words, the extermination, the catastrophe of Polish Jews has been as complete as possible. And this is something that we need to remember. Now, the second thing is that there was also, in addition to these 30 or perhaps 40, if we want to be generous, thousand of Jews who made it in hiding under or in few camps which still existed in Poland. You had about 250 or to 300,000 Jews who fled, Polish Jews who fled into the Soviet Union and then who trickled back to Poland after 1944-45. Now, 300,000 is a fairly large number. An attempt could have been made to recreate minority culture on the ruins of the Holocaust. With these repatriants coming from the East back to Poland. It did not happen. What you have is something that my friend Jan Tomasz Gross called the unwelcoming of survivors. This unwelcoming translated into pogroms. So the refugees, desperate Jewish refugees emerging from hiding or coming from exile back to Poland did not encounter, let's say, an easy admission. Quite to the contrary, they encountered hostility. Which is so surprising and so sad that even the Holocaust did not eradicate anti-Semitism. That anti-Semitism actually, which was strong before the war, acquired even more strength during the war and continued after the war. And as you know, it translated into pogroms, the most famous or infamous of which was Kielce in July 1946, where close to 50 survivors of the Holocaust have been put to death by raging mob of citizens of Kielce, who answered to the call of the alleged ritual murder performed by the Jews on a Christian child. Legends of blood circulating among Christians for hundreds of years triggered a pogrom in 1946. Afterwards, that was the end, let's say, of nation of Polish Jews in Poland, because, let's say, vast majority fled in despair and in huge panic. Now, here it brings me now to today's situation. You have a horrifying legacy of murder, of certain complicity, of anti-Semitism. And in order to deal with this situation, the Polish authorities have been producing history that they can use. Professor Yehuda Bauer from Yad Vashem called it creating a usable past. So in other words, trying to present Holocaust as a nice part of history which enabled, in this case, the Poles or the Hungarians, to offer help to their Jewish co-citizens at the time of need. In Poland, this attempt to distort the Holocaust and to muzzle historians, as you know, translated into institutes being created and richly funded by the state, sets of laws which were to strike or which do strike historians who are nowadays not, let's say, compliant with the party line are being fired, not only for issues regarding Jews and Holocaust, but generally for countering the party line, the official positive narrative espoused by the state, and so on. So here come also my own problems with them. Now I would like to finish this talk of mine with a short citation from Yehuda Bauer. I would like to quote him: "Behind all this lies a reality that many historians have recognized and dealt with. The Holocaust was indeed ein Meister aus Deutschland, master from Germany, as the great poet Paul Celan wrote in his poem Todesfuge. However, it became a European-wide project, and without the participation of certain segments of the population in countries occupied by Nazi Germany or allied with it, the final solution could not have been carried out, or at least not the way it was. Indeed, the story did not end 75 years ago. It is part of the present, or to paraphrase William Faulkner, it is not dead. It is not even past." And with these wise words of Yehuda Bauer, I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. I know we have a question and answer session. If you have questions, the live audience, I will go ahead and repeat them so that the professor can respond. If it's a virtual question, I know the technology will be handling in the back, so we'll deal with it accordingly. So do we have any questions at this point? And I apologize, I know the audio was an issue, but I think you all got the gist of what the professor's talking about. Any questions at all?
Yes.
Yes.
Is what's going on in Poland right now directly related to the current government? Do different governments, then is there more openness with different administrations, or is this like a systemic problem across the decades?
And just to make sure the recording, which I've got taking place, let me just repeat the question. The question recognizes that there's some concern about whether the current policy in Poland is directly the result of today's administration. Is that the concern right now?
Yes.
And whether this is a recent phenomena, because many of you know in other parts of the world, even Germany, for example, there has been a recognition, an open recognition of what occurred, and that recognition has been ongoing for many, many years. In Poland now, we do have a phenomena without question that the current administration is trying to revise history, no question. So, Professor, the question then is this a recent phenomena of the current administration, or has this been a policy that's been ongoing for some time, but has been exacerbated by the current administration?
I would say, thanks for the question. I would say the problem is very deeply rooted. It predates the current nationalists. So their arrival to power in 2015 transformed, I would call it, mild obsession into deep paranoia. So what you had before, the issue of the historical offensive against, let's say, or distortion of the history of the Holocaust has been an element of the policy of the state. It was never central. Now, here, what we see for last 7 years is that that history and the so-called dignity file is at the very core of what Polish nationalists want to, let's say, use to consolidate their electorate. So if you look at the resources poured, sheer resources poured into various kinds of Holocaust distortion that goes on, they are quite astounding. By the way, they actually are reaching the United States as well. One of the recently created institutes, so-called Institute of Pilecki, is planning to open their own booth or institute in New York City. And this is basically exporting the distortion abroad. So to answer your question, I think it's systemic. It has been going on, this feel-good narrative of valiant Polish nation trying to save its Jewish compatriot at a time of need. It has been going on for a long time, but simply nowadays it reached this crescendo and the level of absurd that I can hardly start to describe.
Thank you. And let me emphasize something. If you've not had a chance to read the professor's material and also go online, there is an excellent presentation. You can do a Google search and you can find the progression of this now phenomena. In other words, you can go back just a few years and you'll see this development of what I call revisionist history. I think it's called the Polish Anti-Defamation League or some Anti-Defamation Society.
Yes.
It's very nefarious. And I read a lot of the articles from both ends of the spectrum. A lot of the articles trying to revise history are adroitly written to suggest that they're actually not sending the message they're sending. So I strongly recommend you become educated on this, because I would guess, and I'm not trying to pass judgment on the average Polish citizen, but it's almost unfair for that individual to fully appreciate what's going on when they read articles. Article after article talks about how the Poles did what they could to save the Jews, how everything was designed in Poland to make it impossible for the locals to do anything at all. And in actuality, the Poles to some extent were saviors of the Jews, when sadly that was not really the case. Okay, other questions?
Can you hear me, Professor?
Yes.
Great, thanks. We have an online question from Carly Wiley. She says, thank you for a very moving and eye-opening talk. Can you please share again the name of the author or the name of the work that you quoted at the end of your talk?
Well, thank you. The name is Yehuda Bauer, and he is the most senior Israeli historian of the Holocaust. Yehuda Bauer, he is still active at Yad Vashem Institute of Advanced Holocaust Studies, and I very strongly and warmly recommend to read him and to listen to him.
Yes.
So, what's the current role of the Catholic Church in all of this? And of course, also the competition in Poland and also the Vatican. Because Poland is a very heavily Catholic country, and that's of course part of the problem. Anti-Jewish because of that.
The question, it's a very sensitive question, and that is, you've got a country which has a large percentage of Catholics. And many of you know, I know many of you are far more knowledgeable than I am as to the role of the Catholic Church in the Holocaust. So the question was, what is the role of the Catholic Church right now in light of the Catholic Church's history and the controversy surrounding the Catholic Church? So is the Catholic Church, Professor, taking a position, trying to intervene, or is it becoming part of the revisionist history that's ongoing?
Well, sadly, I have to say that there is no question here. The Polish Catholic Church largely aligned itself with the current right-wing nationalists in various areas of political and social policies, including this historical dignity file. but even more importantly this is perhaps going a bit outside of my area of expertise, but in terms of minority issues, there was and still is ongoing attack on LGBT communities in which and there are many parallels between attacks on the Jews and attacks on LGBT communities. In both cases, the church, through its broadcasting powers, even not only through the teachings in church, but through its broadcasting powers and publication powers, has become a force that had a huge detrimental impact on the way the Polish society sees its history, especially this file that I discussed with you.
Thank you. Let me also emphasize something again. Many of you have already read this. There were many Poles that did sacrifice themselves. I think there's Professor, like 9,000 officially recognized. Many of them
7,000
died as a result of their efforts. I think what the professor is emphasizing, in a country of that many people, even though the Polish should be proud of 9,000 of their citizens did do the right thing, the amount of citizens that didn't, tragically, unfortunately, is far too many.
No, sorry, I just want to add one thing here, if I may. It's the thing is the most interesting thing here is that there are over 7,000 Polish Poles who are recognized as righteous among the nations. The thing is that today they are being used in a very instrumental way in order, let's say, to become this sort of a cover for everybody else. And what we tend to forget, or the official propaganda forgets, is that the Poles who were hiding the Jews, who were saving the Jews, they were mostly afraid not even of the Germans. The Germans had no idea who was hiding. They were deadly afraid of their own neighbors, for whom hiding the Jews was not exactly an activity to be condoned. That's the problem.
Thank you, Professor. Any other questions? Any virtual questions? Yes, you have a question? Yeah, let me, Professor, you've written a rather well-known piece about what's called the Blue Police and the involvement of the Blue Police. Again, many of you realize when the Germans came in, the Polish police force was kept in place, and they go by the nickname, I guess, the Blue Police, and that's that's one of the major subjects the professor's written about. Could you spend a couple of moments explaining about the involvement of the police force once Germany came in?
Right, and so basically, this is one of those questions or themes that were not really well researched. I published a few articles in English, a big book in Polish recently, an English edition is forthcoming. Now, the thing is that when you read the Jewish accounts, testimonies from diaries from Poland from the time of the Shoah, there is practically, it's impossible not to see the Polish officers of this Blue Police, which has been organized by the Germans. But what I found so striking was that these people were actually, I could call it, conducting their own warfare against the Jews, and without any German supervision, without practically any German insight or even a knowledge. And so by 1942, 1943, and 1944, these were in vast majority, regular pre-war Polish policemen who were reorganized by the Germans, but still they regained basically the same kind of structure as they had before. So what they started to do is they moved against the Jews on their own. The Jews became the prey of a choice for them. And these Polish officers were especially deadly because they had such a good knowledge of local community. They were members of local communities. Germans were, stationed in larger towns. They were not present throughout the countryside. They didn't have the manpower. However, this Polish Blue Police was not only everywhere, but they were sons and husbands of local people, and they had extraordinary good insights into who was most likely to harbor the Jews, where the Jews would go for help. So their deadly efficiency was absolutely horrifying, and I try to describe it in some detail in a forthcoming book. It will be published by Indiana University Press in August, Night Without End. I co-edited and co-authored it. You can see on local examples how deadly this force has become. Once again, how you transform regular cops that actually, supervise traffic into very efficient mass murderers is one of these questions that I am still left without clear answers to.
Thank you, Professor. You have another question online?
Yeah, thank you. Michael Rotenberg Schwartz has a good question. I heard recently that despite the law against speaking of Polish complicity, culpability, in practice, teachers in Poland can speak at least a little bit honestly in their classrooms about what happened without fear of punishment, that legal recourse is pursued more in cases when people make public statements. Is this also your sense of things?
No, I mean, the thing is that the teachers, of course, depends. There are courageous ones, there are more, let's say, compliant ones. But the problem is that these trials in which I was co-accused and so on, and the whole apparatus of the state introduced something called a chilling effect. A chilling effect, it means that if you are a teacher, well, your chances for finding another job are not that good. So basically, and I am in touch with teachers who sort of informally communicate with me when I'm in Poland, there is atmosphere of intimidation. Certainly some teachers can be more open, more forthcoming, but to be honest with you, if you look at Polish curricula, school curricula, nothing of what I or host of my colleagues in Poland, critical historians, wrote over the last 20 years, nothing percolated to the school curricula. Quite to the contrary, the hurrah, optimistic, nationalistic narrative is all the rage. So the teachers, it depends. Of course, there are very many courageous people, but generally there is an atmosphere of fear that has been instilled, and it is quite visible.
Thank you. Yes.
Of the 7,000 people who did intervene, what were the most common reasons they gave for acting so differently than the rest of the Polish people?
Of the 7,000 people
Yeah, I heard the question. Yeah.
take action, what were the reasons given for why they were the exception when unfortunately so many
Right.
Poles did not intervene?
The thing is that I tried once to look at a certain typology. Who were because people after the war said different things, right? It's, as a historian, you tend to, let's say, in court they would say one thing in their own. Well, if they, for instance, if they rescued the Jews for money, they wouldn't probably admit to it, and very many, of course, did it for profit, right? Nothing wrong with it if you kept your part of the bargain. So I tried to find for certain patterns. Who are the people who are so extraordinary, who are able to, risk the lives, not only their own lives, but even lives of their families in order to save complete strangers, people who are of different culture, who are aliens from their point of view. So I must tell you that one phenomenon which struck me, and it's not very scientific, I must admit, was something I called the phenomenon of the hut at the edge of the forest. In other words, outsiders of their own community, in their own community, were most likely to offer help to Jews during that time, which is not difficult to understand. Outsiders, people who felt that they did not belong entirely. So as I mentioned, people living at the edge of their community, both in geographic and in mental, let's say, form. They were the most likely ones to offer. So people who felt exclusion themselves, which of course stands to reason. On the other hand, the most obvious place to look for hidden Jews were exactly houses of these people. So this was this vicious circle.
Thank you. Another question I know virtually.
So James Sullivan, who is actually a student in our World War II studies program that I teach in, has a really good question. Says, how does failure of honesty in Poland about its revisionist history translate into the major cities of the United States with significant Polish communities? Do they know what lies, fake news that seem to be obvious?
Well, I can't say much about the United States. I simply don't know very well the U.S. Polish-American situation. I can tell you one thing, that both in Canada and in Poland, the Polish expatriates vote hard right-wing parties, fringe hard right-wing parties for a variety of reasons. In terms of my own study, the explosion of hostility I felt from Polish Canadian community was quite not surprising, but very visible. And this kind of expatriate communities coming together in defense of something they consider good name of their nation being somehow slandered or attacked is a very universal phenomenon. So it is the Poles, but also, let's say, Ukrainians. There is a colleague of mine, John Paul Himka, who was teaching at University of Alberta, and reactions, and he was writing about the troubled past between Ukrainian nationalists and the Jews during World War II. The backlash was severe. So these things tend to be cut across ethnic lines, and I would say that among expatriates living in states or and certainly in Canada, the critical history is not exactly very popular.
Any other questions? That's it? Oh, another one, I'm sorry.
So this question actually comes from me. My name is Jacob Flaz. I am a professor here at Arizona State University. I do research on Poland and Treblinka. And I've always wanted to ask this professor, especially with having read your work, it's been a huge influence. How does someone like myself who does research in Treblinka still navigate these types of restrictions to still tell the truth about what happened? Do you have any advice for researchers who go in to try to uncover these things despite the obstacles faced?
I don't think you will find many obstacles if you are a foreign scholar. I mean, the thing is that if you want, well, the problem is if you want to vie for, let's say, Polish subsidy or grant, you might be under certain pressure. Otherwise, if you want to have access to archives, you can probably have it without major problems. The problems begin when you start to develop links to state-sponsored entities, which are subject to strict control by the Ministry of Culture, such as museum in Treblinka, for instance, which has its own history policy, or the Pilecki or the IPN, or any other institution of the Polish state. Then, of course, you have to be rather vigilant in order not to legitimize them with your own, not to lend them credibility that they do not deserve. But if you want to do research, I don't think you need to ask them for any permissions. You have this good fortune of being an American scholar.
Any other questions? Anything else? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's very helpful. I appreciate it. We do have one additional question from an online participant. Jennifer McKinney writes, what is your experience of modern Polish peoples who leave Poland as immigrants to other countries who truly believe in the current national government in Poland? How detrimental are they to what you and other scholars and activists are trying to achieve on the international stage?
I must say I have not met this kind of issue, or not. I have not encountered, at least not in Canada. It might be perhaps different. I hear that it is different for my colleagues working in Great Britain, where there is a huge hundreds of thousands of recent Polish immigrants. But I must say that I have to plead innocence because simply I was not exposed to this. Occasionally, I have to tell you that I have a different kind of experience. From time to time, I'm still invited to teach classes at University of Warsaw, just, it's an occasional seminar. Or just a lecture in the seminar taught by my historians friends. And then I can see that there are young people straight out of high school who arrive in a university with this very, very, I would say, right-wing patriotic dogma instilled. And this is a challenge, yes.
Any others? I've got, Professor, I do have a question. You and I talked about this. At the beginning, I mentioned that Germany has embraced and taken responsibility. There's a book, and again, this is not my presentation, but I recommend, if you've not read the book, Hitler's Willing Executioners by Goldhagen, that will explain to you what the Germans had to face and what they had to accept. In light of the fact that Germany, which is where this all started to some extent, has accepted responsibility, not just legally, but I think morally. I think they really have accepted what went wrong. Is there hope for Poland, or do we have to simply accept the reality that Poland may not change in the foreseeable future?
Well, that's this very loaded question, which we discussed over the telephone for a moment. But the thing is that I see the assault on history as a part of larger assault against the civic society, against, I would say that societies which are authoritarian populist societies do not deal well with their own history. Democracy actually fosters critical examination of own history. So in case of Poland, I would, and I see the attack on history as a part of this vicious attack on democracy, dismantling of democracy, which is ongoing in Poland. So I think that a way out, if any, it will be through a long process of return to democratic basis of the society, which will allow the creation of a healthy debate, which currently is practically impossible. But this is a long-term solution. I don't think that anything overnight or even over a year will solve this problem.
Thank you very much. No other questions? Again, thank you very much, Professor.
My pleasure and delight, and thank you very much for this invitation. It was, I just am so sorry I couldn't be physically with you, but well, that's the only way we can do it today. So thank you very much for your invitation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.